All right, and welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing on with what we left off on last video. And last video we left off on the model for the users. So today we're going to finish the model for our comments, tweets, roles, and we'll create this through table for the users' roles. So let's just dive right into it. First thing we have to do here is we have the properties. We have to have some way of setting these properties. So we have to generate constructors. So if we go ahead and press Alt Insert, we can generate constructor like this. And first thing we're going to do is generate the default constructor. So we want to select none on that one. And then press enter a couple times. We want to generate another constructor, and this is for all the other properties except for the ID. And that's because the ID is generated automatically through Spring and set in the database. So we're going to go ahead and select all of this and hit OK. And then lastly, Alt Insert, and we want to generate our getters and setters. And Shift click, we want to select all of these getters and setters for everything. So here is our finalized model with our properties, with all of our annotations on it, and then our constructors and our getters and setters. Also, one thing I wanted to note, last time I didn't tell you, but I do have a GitHub repository for this project. I will be creating separate branches for each video. So in this branch, in this project, I will go ahead and do I'm going to call this day 2, and then push origin day 2. Okay, and we will just go ahead and do that. So this lgit command, by the way, if you're interested, this is just a mixture of git add dot, git commit -m with the commit message, and then git push. This is just combining all of that with the commit message and pushing it all up like that. Just a super quick way of doing a git commit. Okay. So let's head back. So now we have our user set up. Let's figure out what model we want to handle next. Let's go ahead and handle comments. So we're going to go into our models package, right click, create a new Java class. Name it comment. And remember, usually you always want to do what it says. In this case, it's asking if I want to add all the files to Git. Yes, I do. Okay, let's go ahead and add our annotations into this. This is an entity. And it is a table in the database. And its name is going to be comments. And we're going to create our long ID with our ID and our generated value with a strategy of identity. And if you were wondering how I was getting those things to pop up, I press Control Spacebar, and then we have quote unquote IntelliSense tell us, what it suggests we put in there. So Control Spacebar is the hotkey for that. So we have our ID in there. We also need content. We also need tweet. So we will handle that in a little bit. We need content, and it looks like we'll handle updated time and created time later. It needs also a reference to the user. So we'll do content and user. So we'll do private string content and private user. So you want to pass in the whole user object here, not just the ID that user has. And the reason for that is when you go to your controller and you request a comment, the comment also not only does it need to know the ID, but it needs to know like what's the username that created the comment, what is the handle, and any other associated tables that link to the user. So we need the whole user object in here. And it is throwing an error here because you can't just input a user. You need to tell it what relationship the user has with the comment. So in this case, a a comment can only have one user, but a user can have multiple comments. So this would be a many-to-one, I believe. Yes. Okay, so it's going to be a many-to-one, and we want to join column. And the column name, this name property here, this is actually this is what we're going to be calling it as a column in the database. So this is a many-to-one relationship. And then when we finally call comments, we want it to join the column. We want to tell it this column right here represents the primary key for user. And we're going to give it a name of, say, user ID. So now it will create a column on the table called user ID, and it will contain the primary key for user. A couple other things we have to do here is Cascade. So this basically means if you ever update this comment, or I'm sorry, if you ever update the user, then it will also affect this comment. So if you delete the user, it'll delete all the comments. If you update the user or anything that relates to the comment in the user table, then it will also update this row in the user table. That's what the cascade.all does. And then we also, I believe, oh, nope, that is going to be handled in the other one. So we have a many-to-one table with cascading, and we join the columns here, and we have the property there. So now we also have to go to our user, and we need to somehow reference that users can have multiple comments. So whenever you have multiple of something, you have either an array or a list or something along those lines. So in this case, we want to have a private set, and a set is a special Java list that only allows you to have unique items in there. So you can never have duplicate comments. And when I say duplicate comments, I don't mean duplicate content, I mean duplicate primary keys. So comments will always be unique. So we're having a set of comment. We're going to call it comments. And we're going to set this one already as a default value to a new hash set. And now this is also going to complain because we have to give this some sort of field type. So this would be a one-to-many, and it's going to be mapped by. So this mapped by property here, this is saying, well, this is a many-to-one relationship. Where is the definition for this many-to-one relationship? And if you remember, we set that definition up in the comment model itself. Under user, we have defined this many-to-one table, and we have told it what join column it is. So the mapped by property is the actual name of this property. Not this name, but the property of the Java object itself. So we have a private user, that's the variable type. We want the variable name, which is under lowercase user. So it's going to be mapped by user. So it's going to reach into the comment class, and it's going to look for the user variable. We want orphan removal to be true, and that just means that if there's ever a comment out there in the database that is no longer linked up to a user, we're going to remove that. So we have our one-to-many relationship. We should be good for now. Okay, so we have our ID, content, and our user. Let's go ahead and generate our constructor for this. Select none for the default constructor, and then we will select everything except for the ID for the custom constructor. Alt insert, getters and setters, select all, shift click, OK. And here we have our new quote unquote bean. So let's go ahead and created comment class. Okay, and now what else do we have? We need to make a tweets table. So let's go over here, right click, new Java class. We're going to call this tweet. It is an entity. We do want it to create a table. and the name of that table is going to be tweets. It will have an ID, and its generated value will be generated by the strategy of identity. It's going to be a private long, and it's going to be called ID. So our tweets have an ID content, and it also needs a reference to the user that created the tweet. And then when we have this tweet set up, we can also link it to comment, because tweets can have multiple comments, but comments can only be related to one tweet. So let's go over here. We need some private string content, and I don't remember, did we? Nope, no annotations on that one. So we need the reference to the user object that created it. It is a many to one, and we want to join. The name will be user ID. Let me go take a look at this. Oh, and we want the Cascade on there. Cascade is cascade type.all, and that should be set up there. So now that we have a tweet class, we can head over to our comment class. We want to give this comment a reference to the tweet that it is a comment for. So we're going to go ahead and create another private tweet. It is going to be a many to one. Yes. Cascade will be cascade type.all. We want to join the column. Name is going to be tweet ID. Okay. And the reason it's throwing these errors here is because we're using the in-memory database, and IntelliJ is actually looking for, it's looking in this databases right here to see if you actually have a database linked up to it. And it's searching for tables with the name of comments. It's searching for columns with the name of tweet ID and user ID. But since we're using an in-memory database, not PostgreSQL that is running locally on our machine, then it's going to fail because it's not going to find those. It's not going to find the database at all. Okay, so we have a reference to the tweet. So now tweets need a reference to all the comments that it has. So we want it to have a set of comments, and to set it equal to a new hash set. And this is going to be a one-to-many relationships that is mapped by, if we go under comment, here we have our tweet. So it's going to be called tweet because this is where we join the column. So we have tweet. We'll go ahead and copy that. It's mapped by tweet. We want to set its orphan removal to true. And now we want to generate our constructor. And we don't want to send arrays through our constructor. So we only want to set the single entity types. So like strings, booleans, date times, stuff like that. These sets, we'll go ahead and assign those in the getters and setters. So let's go ahead and pop in our getters and setters for everything. And here's another bean. And let's also make sure we generate a getter and setter for our tweet. So we scroll down here, Alt insert, getter and setter, and okay. Let's just be sure that we also have a getter and setter for everything that we need here. We need a getter and setter for comments. And also, we need to create another property on the user object that references a list of tweets. So we'll have a private set of tweet, call it tweets is equal to a new hash set. It's going to be a one-to-many, and it's mapped by, if we go into tweet, it's mapped by user. Yes. Right? Am I right here? Yes. So it's mapped by user. And we want orphan removal to be true. Okay, so that is that set up. Let's go ahead and run this and make sure our tables are being generated properly. Shouldn't have any errors. Let's head back to our H2 console. Reconnect. We have comments, tweets, and users. And here you can see we have ID content. Here's the tweet ID. This is the name that we set. Here is the name, user ID, name, tweet ID. So notice that these are called user ID. They're not called tweet. So we have user ID and tweet. And then if we go ahead and check at our tweets, we have ID content and user ID. It will not hold references to the set of comments that it has, because that's something that Spring does on the back end. Because remember, if you go to your comments, the comment actually has a reference to the tweet ID. So Spring will handle all of that for us. And if we go to our users, we'll see ID, email, handle, password, and that should be good still, because the other two properties were sets. We have ID, email, password, and we have a set, and we have a set. So there's those. Let's see, we have tweets. We have comments, we have tweets, comments, users. Now we need to create roles. So this is going to be the interesting one, because this is a many-to-many relationship. So the creation of the roles table is pretty straightforward. Remember that roles does, user roles, I'm sorry. So roles will still have an ID and everything. User roles, if you notice, does not have a primary key. Well, it doesn't have a single primary key. It actually has two primary keys. And that's the user ID and the role ID. So if we head back to IntelliJ, let's go back and create a new model. And we'll call this role. It is an entity, and it is a table, and its name will be roles. And we will give it an ID with the generated value. Strategy will be, no, not auto. Identity. We'll give it a private long ID. And then roles also needs a name. So we'll give it a private string name. And if you remember, when we head back over here, I believe we had made roles so that it is not null and unique. So let's head back over here. We'll do it at column definition. We'll call it nullable is false, and unique is true. I believe we also have to go to comment, and for our content, we should also do nullable is false. So let's comment, content, nullable is false. And our tweet, content, column, nullable, false. So now the content on our comments and our tweets will not be nullable. So I'm going to go ahead and close all of the other models that we have open so that we don't get confused. Now we just have role open. We have an ID. We have a name. Let's go ahead and generate our constructor. Select none. And then we'll generate our constructor with just a name parameter. And then our getters and setters with everything. And here's yet another bean. Let's go ahead and push this up. All right. So now we have the fun job of creating this through table so that we can link multiple users to multiple roles and multiple roles to multiple users. So let's go ahead and right click, create a new Java class. I'm going to call this one user roles. Okay, this is an entity. This is a table, and its name is user roles. Okay, so this one's a little funky because remember this one doesn't have generated values. It doesn't have an auto incrementing primary key. This one's ID will be a private user. So here we have a user, and then we want another ID of role. So now we have our user and our role, and on the back end, this will be handled as IDs with a little setup. There is a little more hoops we have to jump through here for this. And then our created time and updated time, we will add those later. So here we have our users and our roles. Let's go ahead and generate, a constructor and a constructor with both parameters and our getters and setters. Okay, so here's the fun part. We need to have some way of telling Spring Framework where to find, like what defines a user. How do you save a user or a role into the database under this user roles class? So basically we need to have some way of having multiple IDs and holding those in an object. So we're going to do that by creating another new model, but this model will not be saved into the database per se. So I'm going to call this user roles ID. So this will be the ID class that will hold the long variable type for users and roles. And these do need to be named the same as these. So user, it needs to be called user. If you see here, we'll say private long user and then private long role. So private long user, private long role. And we don't, this is not an entity, but it is, if you watch this awesome annotation trick here, this is a an ID class. And so then with this ID class, we have to pass in the class name of this class that we just created. So we're going to call this user roles ID, and you can't just pass in a regular class, of course, so you have to say dot class. So this is the actual class itself, and then if you'll notice here, it's going to throw us another error. So the class user roles ID should implement java.io.serializable. So in this instance, we need to implement an interface that tells Java how it can serialize or convert a Java object into a text object or a data object or an XML or a JSON, anything like that. So that's serialization. So it needs to implement serializable. And ironically enough, so does this. So both the class itself that has the ID class in it, the class itself needs to implement serializable, and the ID class itself needs to implement serializable. So we'll go ahead and generate our constructors for these, and our getters and setters. And then there's one other thing that's kind of a pain in the butt that we have to do to this. So we have our constructor, we have our getters and setters. Okay, so in order for something to be serializable, we have to tell it, how do you check if something is equal? Like, how do you know if one object of type user roles is equal to another object of type user roles? And we're going to do that by overriding something, two methods, one called get hashcode and one called equals. So we will control O. I'm sorry, not get hashcode, it's just hashcode. So hashcode and then control and click and equals. These are the two methods that we have to override. And this will this will be how we tell Java how to check if one object is equal to another object. And we have to do the same thing over here on the user roles ID. Control O, control click, OK. So we'll work on the user roles ID first because it's rather simple. So we don't want to call super.get hashcode. We just want to return whatever number you want. I like to return 14. I don't know the actual reason for this. From what I remember, it's going to check the hash codes, and if the hash codes are equal, then it's going to run the equals method. So we're going to hard code it so that the hash codes are equal, and then it will by default always run the equals method. We're going to remove that in there. So we're going to write our own equals implementation. And what I say by equals, I mean like some var is equal to some other var. So when you call this double equals here, it runs this equals method. So we want to tell Java how to check if something is equal. So what we're going to do is we're going to check if object is equal to this. So if this instance right now, if this instance is this object, then we're going to run true because, well, yeah, this instance is that object. So obviously they're equal. Then we're going to check if object is not equal to null. Let's see, let me think here. If object is equal to null, or object dot get class is not equal to this dot get class, then we want to return false. So we're saying if this object right here is null, then obviously it's not equal to the current instance of the object. And then if this object's class, because if you see here, we're passing it in as an object. So if the object's class is not equal to this object's class, well, then obviously they're not equal. So if we have gotten past this line of code here, we obviously know that this object is of the same class as user roles ID, because we've checked right here to see if the classes are equal. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable called that. And I'm going to set it equal to, we're just going to set it equal to object. So now this object, as it comes in right now, is an object. We want to cast that into the current object that we are working with. And in this case, it's user roles ID. And that converts object into user roles ID. We know this will work because we've already passed this if statement. Otherwise, there's a potential for it to throw an exception if you don't have this if statement in there, or if you don't do any kind of validation to check if the classes are equal. So what we're going to do is we're going to return a Boolean statement, and we're going to check to see if this dot get role is equal to that dot get role, and this dot get user is equal to that dot get user. Get role. Okay, so remember, these are long values. So these are numbers. So we'll say if this number is equal to that number and that number is equal to that number, then we're true. And that is the full implementation of the equals method for the user roles ID. Now we got the user roles. This one's trickier. So we're still going to do the same thing as before. We're still going to check if object is equal to this. We're going to return true if object is equal to null, or object.getClass is not equal to this dot get class. We return false. And then if we've passed that, then we know that the classes are equal. So we're going to cast those into a user roles object into a variable called that. So we've reached this point. We want to return a Boolean value. We're going to do some checking here. So in this check, I'm going to check to see, first of all, that this dot role, I'm going to make this consistent. This dot get role. If get role is equal to null. If we don't have a role, we're going to return a 0. Otherwise, this dot get role dot get ID. So it's either going to be 0 or the ID of that role. So if that happens, let's see, this dot get role blah, 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 is equal to that dot get role is equal to null, 0 that dot get role. What did I do wrong here? There, let's just go ahead and do. Oh wait, well, that's weird. How did that work? Oh, it didn't. Yay for debugging on the go. So that worked. Or did it? So we want to wrap that around brackets. Wrap that around brackets. So 0 get role ID. Oh, that's why. All that debugging for nothing. Okay, and this dot get user. If it's equal to null, we're going to return a 0, or this dot get user dot get ID. We're going to check to make sure it's equal to that dot get user is equal to null, 0, or that dot get user dot get ID. Okay. A little bit more verbose, but essentially the same thing. We're checking the role IDs to make sure the role IDs are the same, and we're checking the user IDs to make sure the user IDs are the same. And we also want to return whatever random number that you want. I return 14 because that was the number that I was in football in high school. Okay. So we have user roles. This is a many-to-one, and it's going to join column. Name is user ID, and Cascade. No Cascade. Yes, Cascade. I'm confused. Why is that not working now? Go to tweet. Oh, I guess. Oh, that's why Cascade goes on them. See? Annotation heck. Cascade type dot all. All right. So let's just go ahead and copy that. Slap that down there. Change this to role ID. Okay. So we've set up our many-to-one relationship for our users and our roles. Now we have to go into role. So if every role needs to know what users they're assigned to. So we're going to say private set. So they're not going to be users. They're going to be user roles. So we don't want a set of users. We want a set of user roles. And we're going to call this one users equals new hash set. So it's a set of user roles called users. Pain in the butt. So this is a one-to-many that is mapped by, if we go into our user roles, it's mapped by the field called user. Oh, I'm sorry. It'll be mapped by the field called role. Yeah. And then orphan removal true. Okay. Let's go into our user. Because we also want a private set of user roles for roles is a new hash set, and it is also a one-to-many that is mapped by role with or from rule will be true. Role. Oh. User. That should be correct. If not, we'll change it later. Getter and setters for both roles and tweets. Always want to make sure you have the getters and setters for everything. Go down here. I know user roles is fine. Tweet. Getters and setters. We're good there. What did I do? That doesn't... Was it this one? Aha. Users. Okay. Let's run this and see what happens. All right. We're live. We're going to reload, resend, connect. Here we have our user roles table with a role ID and a user ID. And if we pop that down, we'll see that they are, they are in fact numbers, big ints, which is the SQL version of a long. And then we have users. See, we don't have any references to roles in here. If we go into roles, we don't have any references to users because that's all taken care of in this through table for user roles. And then, so yeah, we are good with our user roles table. So that handles comments, tweets, users, roles, and user roles. Comments, tweets, roles, users, roles. All right, that's all of our models. Pat yourselves in the back because that's the models. So now that we have our models, we need to have some way of accessing and saving data within those models. And those are handled in something called repositories. So we want to right click, we want to create a new package, call it repositories. So each model will have its own repository. Each model that is persistent, each bean will have its own repository. So we'll create a new Java class. So these actually won't be classes, these will be interfaces because they're going to implement something very helpful. We're going to call this users repository. So here we have our public interface users repository, and watch how easy this is. It's going to extend from CRUD repository. CRUD repository needs two types. It needs to know what model it's for and then what the variable type for the ID is. So the model is a user. Make sure it is from your package, not any of these packages. So it's a user, and it is of type long with a capital L. And that's it. We have our users repositories. We also have a tweets repository. Am I spelling that? Repositories, yes. Tweets repositories. It's going to extend from CRUD, our repository, tweet long. And CRUD, if you didn't know, CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. So this is the whole basis of a RESTful API is CRUD. Create, read, update, and delete. So it's a CRUD repository. So we need, what other models do we have? Roles repository. Interface. Make sure you're doing interfaces and not classes for these. Extends CRUD repository. It is for role of type long. And then what else we got? Comment. We need comments repository. It is an interface. We're going to extend from CRUD repository for a comment of type long. And that should be all the repositories we need. We don't need any repositories for user roles. Because remember, this is a through table, and users will always know their roles from that table, and roles will always know their users from that table. Okay, let's go ahead and do a git commit in here. Make sure you're committing often if you are using GitHub or any other Git service. Speaking of service, we have our models, we have our repositories. Now we need some way of getting data in and out of the repository. And we do that in services. Lots and lots of different packages here. We have services. So in our service, we're going to create interfaces and classes, but these interfaces, these will dictate what the class can do. So if we do user services, so we have a public interface, user services. What do we want to get from our database? We want to be able to find all of our users. Okay. So let's just do a little template here. We want a list of user. That's going to be our return type. What's the method going to be called? We'll just call it find all. And we don't need any parameters in there. We just want to find all the users and output a list of users. Cool. What else do we need? We need a way to save users into the database. Okay. So return type user, because when you save something in the repository, it will always output back what you save into it. So it outputs a user. We're going to call it save user. So we're outputting a user. The method is called save. Our input parameter is of type user, and the name of the parameter is user. These are not, you can name these whatever you want. You can name these foo and bar. You can call these turtle if you like. But that just wouldn't be very descriptive. So we have a way of finding all the users, and we have a way of saving a user. I think that should be good for now. Let's do one more. Let's create another new service. Let's call this role services. It's an interface. They don't need to extend from anything, by the way, in case you were wondering. So what do we want from our role services? Basically the same thing as the user services. We want to be able to get a list of all the roles in our database. So we'll create a list of roles, call it find all, with no parameters. We just want to get all the roles in our database. We also want to be able to save a role in our database. We'll have a role save with a type of role and the value of the type of role name is role. Okay, for right now, I think that's okay. We need to have some way of implementing these interfaces. So this is where you're going to make these classes. You're going to create a new class. You're going to call this one user services implementation. It is a class. Let's go ahead and press enter on this one. And we have those interfaces. Now we want to implement these interfaces. We're going to implement user services, and here we'll see some errors. It needs us to override. It needs us to have some way of implementing those interfaces that we just came up with under here. As you'll see here, we have some related problems. We'll click on that, jumps us here. It's because we have not implemented or declared find all and the save function. So we'll go ahead and implement these methods. Let's go ahead and implement all of them. And look at that. Error went away. Well, we said in the beginning that all of these actions will be taking place in the repository. That's why we extended from the CRUD repository. Yes, you're right. So we need to have some way of bringing that in. So we're going to, let's just declare a user repository. We'll call it whatever, users repository. But where's that coming from? Well, here's the magic of annotations again. We're going to auto wire this in. So Spring will take this user's repository with all of its functionality, even though it's an interface, and it's going to wire it in as a class with fully implemented features, fully implemented finds and saves, and being able to do whatever. It's going to wire it in here, and we can use it in our service. So we're going to find all. So find all. What do we want? We want to return a list of users. So let's do a list of users is a new array list. Okay. Let's check out, see what we got in our users repository. If we go users repository dot. Oh, look at that. Look at all the handy stuff that we get from the CRUD repository. So much stuff. Well, if you look at the top, we got find all. It returns a iterator, if I remember correctly. What is this? It is iterable. Okay, so dot. We're going to access the iterator. And then for each remaining item in the iterator, we're going to call user add. This is some fancy dancy Java shortcut that just lets you add to the array every time it hits the every time it sees a new item in this iterator. It's a funny shortcut hand way of doing it, but it works, and it works great. So after that, we're just going to return user. Actually, we're going to make this plural, users and users. Okay, awesome. So we have a way of returning all of our users now. Okay, awesome. And we need to save our user now. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. It's going to be a little funky, but hear me out. So we're going to create a new user. New user is equal to a new user. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to run everything under user. We're going to run into our setters for new user. That way, if there's any custom implementations that you have in your setters, for instance, if you wanted to make their handles all have lowercase letters, if you wanted to hash their passwords, which we will get to when we start implementing security. If you wanted to hash their passwords, you'll do that in the setters. So we want to run everything from user through our setters. And this also is sort of double checking and making sure that we're setting everything correctly before they go into the database. It's our own way of doing validation before things go into our database. We want clean data. So, new user dot set. Okay, well, what do we got here? We got email. User dot get email. Okay. User dot set. What else do we got here? Handle. Okay. User dot get handle. All right, cool. So now what we want to do is, instead of setting through a setter for our sets, yeah, that's a lot of sets. For our sets, instead of setting them, we're going to actually iterate through them and set them that way. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and new user. So new user already has a new array list. So what we're going to do is we're going to say for, let's see. Let's do tweets. Okay, let's do tweets. For tweet t in user colon in user dot get tweets. So for each tweet, we're going to call new user dot get tweets dot add tweet. So loop them through our tweets, and we'll add each one of them to the new set that we have for a user. Okay, awesome. For now, I think that'll be okay. Unless we also want to do, let's go ahead and let's auto wire our role. Now let's not worry about that right now. Okay. So let's just return users repository dot save new user. This will return us the user that was created in the database with a primary key and with all relationships already in place. Awesome. Let's make sure that this can run, make sure there's no errors. Okay. Make sure that our data is still being created. Awesome. Cool. Okay, so for now, let's go over here to our user. Let's make sure that we don't have any. Okay, so we don't have any of these columns that are sets. We don't have any of these as not nullable. So we can go ahead and start working on putting some seed data in our database, which I promised you guys I would get to on my next video. So we're going to do it real fast. So we're going to create a new Java class in our root directory where it says Twitter clone, not under models, repositories, or service. We want it to be in the same directory as the application itself, the Twitter clone application. I'm going to call this seed data. You can call it whatever you like. I just like to be descriptive about it. So it's a public class seed data. What this is going to do is it's going to implement command line runner. So public class seed data implements command line runner. Well, there's an error. What's wrong? It wants us to implement methods and it wants us to implement run. Awesome. Everything that we do that's going to go in our database in this seed data function needs to be in run. This is what gets called sort of like public static void main string args. This right here is what gets called when you start seeding your data. We also need to tell Spring Boot that this is that it needs to manage this. It needs to call this before you open up any endpoints. We need to make sure our seed data is set. So we're simply just going to annotate this with a component. When you annotate this as a component, it turns this plain old Java object into a bean. As you can see here, we have it's now a Spring Bean. It's now being managed by Spring. Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and auto wire. Let's auto wire our user service that we had just done. Let's auto wire that in. And if you'll notice here, we have a red squiggly line. You can't auto wire in user service. Well, you can, but we forgot an annotation. We head back over to our user service implementation. It implements user service, but it's not a bean. So we need to make this a bean and also let Spring Framework know that this is a service. So it's annotated with service, turns this into a bean. If we go back into our seed data, this is now being wired in as a service. So let's go ahead and create our first user. So user, new user is equal to a new user. Let's say new user dot set handle. Let's call this dude person. New user dot set email. Dude person at dude.com. New user dot set. What else we got? Set password. Life's a garden. Dig it. New user dot set. What else do we got here? We got handle, email, password. We got handle, email, password. These are the only not nullable fields. So let's go into our seed data. So that should be good there. And then we're just going to call our user service dot save, and we're going to save our new user. Awesome. Let's go ahead and check to see if this runs. And just as I thought, we've got an issue here, and it failed to start the command line runner. Could not execute statement. Let's see, null not allowed for password. User service implementation. In our save, we have set our handle, but we've never set our password. So we now have user.setPassword, and we got that right here. This is a null not allowed for column password. Okay, so now we're setting our password. Let's go ahead and try this again. Okay, looks promising. Let's go ahead and connect to it again. Let's go ahead and check to see our users. Aha! Would you look at that? We've got some stuff in our database. Our first seed data. Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there for right now. Next video, we'll pick up where we left off. We will continue creating our services and our service implementations. We will expand on our seed data, and we will start implementing some controllers so that we can access this backend from a third-party service, say like Postman or any other RESTful way. So I will go ahead and added seed data, make my last commit, and this will be under the branch day 2 in case you got lost. That will have all the up-to-date code. I do not do any coding off camera, so you guys will always have the most up-to-date code. All right. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.